Welcome to episode 19 of Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, a series of informal conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. In these conversations, we're speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. I'm Ntina Tzouvala, Associate Professor at the ANU College of Law, and this afternoon I'm being joined by our usual host, Professor Douglas Guilfoyle of UNSW Canberra, and by Dr. Tamsin Paige, Senior Lecturer at Deakin Law School, to talk about the deteriorating situation in the Middle East. Before we get to it, let's start with something light. Our traditional first question. Douglas, Tamsin, what's your drink of choice? It is Thursday, the 3rd of October at 3:16 p.m.
Right. Well, despite the deteriorating situation in the Middle East, I've resisted the temptation to pour myself something stronger. And I am presently drinking what I think of as a non-alcoholic spirit and tonic. So I have some Tasmanian tonic water, a dash of lime, and the last of our distilled Seedlip Spice 94, a non-alcoholic spirit.
Yes, that's a good one. Tamsin?
It's actually quite a sunny spring afternoon here in Canberra, and I've just been at physio, so I am going with some hydration with mineral water that's got a twist of blood orange and mango.
Nice one. And I am having instant coffee with almond milk because I'm classy like that. Okay, I clarified before that it's the 3rd of October because obviously things are moving extremely fast. And I suspect that the moment we finish recording this podcast, it will already have been superseded by events. And I'm saying that because when we first decided to record this episode a week ago, our aim was to focus on the Paige's attack that took place against members of Hezbollah in Lebanon on the 17th of September. Since then, though, a lot has happened. Israel has launched a ground invasion against Lebanon, and Iran launched yesterday a missiles attack against Mossad's headquarters in Tel Aviv. Many Western powers condemned the latter as an act of aggression and expressed, grave concerns about the former. In this episode, we will discuss some international legal aspects of these events, focusing on international humanitarian law, namely jus in bello, and the international law on the use of force, namely jus ad bellum. And we will also discuss the role of the international lawyers as a profession in legitimizing war and perhaps ultimately delegitimizing themselves or ourselves. However, I want to start by everything that we say must be read in light of one essential truth. Law is one, and I would say frankly, minor aspect of what is unfolding in the Middle East. Indeed, legal discussions cannot and should not obscure the fact that what is at stake is human lives, critical infrastructure, and environmental destruction, as well as the possibility of further escalation and the outbreak of a generalized, regional, or God forbid, broader war. All right, these were my disclaimers. With this in mind, Tamsin and Douglas, you are the podcast's IHL, International Humanitarian Law experts. And for that reason, I wanted to ask you about the Paige's attack, which, to remind our audience, involved Israel infiltrating the supply chains of Hezbollah and essentially turning the batteries of thousands of pagers into bombs, which were remotely detonated at the same time a couple of weeks ago. International Law Twitter discussed extensively the lawfulness or unlawfulness of these attacks in reference to international humanitarian law. And in particular, many of the disagreements focused on whether these attacks complied with the requirements of distinction proportionality and precautions in attack. Can you give us your 5 cents on this question? And I will start with Tamsin.
I will unmute and then get going. I want to start by saying, further to what you said, that Lucas Roda made the most insightful comment regarding the Paige's attack in a debate on Twitter about it, where he said, "This is not a game of is it cake," referring to the way that so many international lawyers had been playing with the legality around the targeting, around the booby traps question, and all of these things, as if it was a purely academic exercise of is it cake or not. And that for me kind of summed up the last few years of watching IHL Twitter discuss targeting legality. And one of the things that I've commented elsewhere in a public lecture of, like, all war is a fucking crime. And so I kind of want to ground it in that discussion that you were making. This is about lives, this is about infrastructure, this is about all these things. This is not a game of is it cake. And I think we need to start our discussion with that awareness. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn to the question of the Pages and targeting law. I think that the Pages attack was a gross violation of targeting law on a couple of different fronts. The first one is the question of the fact that there was an indiscriminate attack. They couldn't control who the pages were being distributed to. They say, yes, they're all members of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has medics. Hezbollah has doctors. Hezbollah has civilian administrative staff. They are non-combatants. So therefore, they're not valid targets. Regardless of that, there's a whole bunch of that. They couldn't control who was being targeted by them. And that's before we even factor in Lebanese civilians within the blast zones. So there was a whole bunch of questions there for all of the people saying, oh, but they're all terrorists because they're members of Hezbollah. Well, if they're all terrorists, then domestic law applies and go and arrest them. Because if they're combatants, they're belligerents, they're not terrorists. And if they're terrorists, then domestic law applies, in which case Lebanese domestic law needs to be applied to them, and a use of force in policing is in self-defense or defense of another as a last resort after warnings have been given to the individual being targeted. So if they're terrorists, then you couldn't target them anyway in that regard. This bullshit of saying, oh, but they're terrorists, to give away these rules of targeting and making everyone a target, which has been happening for a very long time. Gary Simpson took aim at it in his book Law, War and Crime in 2007. This is not a new problem. But if they're terrorists, then criminal law applies. Go arrest them. And that don't target them with indiscriminate bombs. In terms of civilian versus military targets, sure, I'm sure some of them might have been military targets. I don't excuse that. Proportionality, well, you're detonating them in all of these civilian areas. There were children present, there were non-combatants present, there were civilians present. That's not meeting a threshold of proportionality, even if you had military targets and even if you were saying that they were targeted and not indiscriminate, which evidence suggests they're not. So, I think we're playing war crimes bingo at this point with that attack. And I'll pass over to Douglas now.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Tamsin. Douglas.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with anything Tamsin said, but I'll just kind of put it in my own, I suppose, more formalist terms. So we'd normally conceive of the applicable law, as you've said, Dina, as embodying questions of distinction. We should only target military targets, and we should never deliberately target civilian targets. Proportionality, that the damage done by an attack should not be disproportionate to the concrete and direct military advantages gained by the attack, and precaution in attack. So to quote from Article 57 of Additional Protocol 1, the attacker should take all feasible precautions in the choice of means and method of attack with a view to avoiding and in any event minimizing incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians and damage to civilian objects. And that goes to Tamsin's question of indiscriminate weapons. If you choose an indiscriminate weapon, you can, under no circumstances, comply with the duty of precaution, which then feeds into the question of distinction, right? And if we violate any of these principles, we don't even have to get to proportionality. right? We don't have to say that, and I'm just going to be dry and horrendous about this, but, for example, we don't have to ask the question, was the killing of several children and a number of medics proportionate to the number of Hezbollah combatants maimed or rendered hors de combat? And I've definitely seen people in the Twitterverse go, it's too early to make a call on proportionality. Then when pushed, they'll go, oh, yes, I'll concede that it was illegal on other grounds. This goes to Tamsin's thing about the terms of debate. A lot of international humanitarian lawyers at the moment seem more interested in pointing out why other people are wrong than actually conducting an analysis of, all the principles that might be in play. Okay, so with all of those things said, we get to that question about, well, who is a civilian? Now, that does get messier with a non-state armed group, because again, we know from international humanitarian law that a civilian, someone who is not part of a conventional military, may lose their civilian status and protection for so long as they are a direct participant in hostilities. So the question then becomes, when you look at a group like Hezbollah, who is a direct participant in hostilities, who is therefore targetable? Now, tying this back to the point Tamsin was making, there is no view of direct participant in hostilities that would say everyone who merely has a membership card that says Hezbollah somewhere in their bedroom drawer is a direct participant in hostilities at all times. Now, there's debate about where you draw that line, and there has been some controversy around the Red Cross standard of continuous combat function, but that's not a bad place to start, right? Like most military lawyers would accept that there are people who we would consider part of the Hamas infrastructure on an ongoing basis who are not targetable under that standard. And that would include, for example, the diplomatic wing of an armed movement, or elements of the political wing that were not engaged in making actual battlefield decisions, right? Yes. And sometimes these armed groups replace effectively civil government and a lot of civil government functions. And as we've already said, medics. Now, the point to be made here again is reciprocity, right? If all medics associated with a party to a conflict are targetable, then Israel's hospitals are targets also. All right, now we put all of that out there and just go, this looks like the kind of weapon that can't comply with those principles we've laid out. But again, we don't even need to go that far on doctrinal analysis, because Israel is a party to amended Protocol 2 of the slightly Orwellianly named Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. And in Article 7, it has a prohibition on booby traps. Now, again, there are broader and narrower definitions or interpretations of the booby trap provision, but the one I want to focus on briefly is Article 7, Paragraph 2, which states simply, it is prohibited to use booby traps or other devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material. Now, there was a certain amount of debate, again in the Twitterverse, about, oh, well, if the pages were made first and then explosives were put in later, that doesn't seem to be a complete object that was specifically designed and constructed to contain the explosive material. Now, this is the is it cake, right, interpretation. Civilians shouldn't have to go around playing a guessing game with objects as to whether they contain explosives or not. But as more facts have come to light, it appears that these pages were custom manufactured for Hezbollah by a shell company, BAC Consulting, trading out of Hungary, that was licensed to make Taiwanese designed pages and specifically incorporated the explosive material from the beginning. So I'm not sure actually, Dina, that it was a case of the batteries being weaponized. That was an initial thesis, that the device was rigged so the batteries would heat up and explode. That would actually be quite difficult to time. It appears a small amount of military-grade explosive was built into these things from the outset. So even on the narrowest possible interpretation of Article 7.2, this is a plain violation of weapons law. So I agree with the broad analysis. We've got real problems here with precaution in attack. We've got real problems with distinction because you've released 3,000 pages into the Hezbollah ecosystem. You can't even be sure they all stay even with Hezbollah members. You can't be sure that everyone who carries a Hezbollah membership card is legitimately targetable anyway. Quite apart from all of those problems, we have a plain violation of the prohibition on booby traps, even if you interpret it in the narrowest possible terms. And every now and then I go off on one of my formalist rants, and that probably was one, and I'll draw a line under it there.
Absolutely. No. And I think you both raised a question that, in a sense, is equally relevant to Lebanon and to Gaza, which is there seems to be a lay argument, but I think the lay argument appears to build on Israel's formal justifications, which is pretty much anyone affiliated with Hamas or Hezbollah is a combatant, right? And therefore can be, like, Israel says explicitly that its purpose is, for example, to destroy Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It doesn't say they want to destroy their military capabilities or that they want to destroy, they say they want to destroy Hamas, right? Or the same with Hezbollah. And for those listeners perhaps who don't know, like, Hezbollah in parts of Lebanon, especially in parts of southern Lebanon, basically performs functions that we usually in the global north associate with a state. It provides welfare to many of its constituents, including notably like Shia Muslims. There is hospitals that are run, there is like food distribution depots that are run, and there are people who participate in these operations, welfare operations, without necessarily carrying a weapon and being part of attacks against Israel or against others, right? Just for those who don't necessarily know. And the same with the Gaza Strip, which is Hamas was the government, right? Was it a fantastic government? Probably not. But it nevertheless ran, the civil service and ministries and things like that. So the idea that every person who sits in a desk and does bureaucratic job is a combatant, I don't know how much of IHL survives if we agree that that's a classification, that everyone is a member of a party.
And again, it goes to the reciprocity point, right? If you want to say that everyone who has any administrative or health or population sustaining function in Hezbollah is a legitimate military target, then everyone who performs such functions in Israel is also a legitimate target. But I think Tamsin had a point she wanted to come back to.
Tamsin.
Yeah, first of all, on the point of if everyone in Hezbollah is a target, then everyone in Israel and anyone in any other government role is a target as well. Yes, IHL doesn't survive, but also that's completely fucking batshit bonkers. No one wants that in a war. No one. No one. No one wants that as a circumstance in targeting for a war unless they are actually sociopathically insane. So I just want to kind of put that out there. But the point I want to make on Hezbollah and Hamas particularly, they're highly organized armed groups. And so the question of DPH and continuous combat function, I think, is actually very well mitigated by Article 4.2 of the Geneva Convention 3, which requires members of an organized armed group or a militia who are to wear uniforms and be distinctly recognizable. So there's an obligation on Hamas and Hezbollah for their combatants to be in some form of recognizable uniform. And then there's an obligation on Israel to confirm targetable status before targeting. So whether or not Hezbollah and Hamas are doing that is on them, and they have got an obligation to that. But also Israel, if Hezbollah and Hamas aren't doing that, that doesn't mitigate Israel's obligation to confirm targeting before engaging that, which when you're just getting your enemies to randomly distribute pages means you can't be fulfilling that obligation anyway. So that's the kind of point I wanted to come back to on the armed group
Sure.
DPH question.
Yes. Any comments on the booby traps question before we move on?
Look,
I think Doug was so categorical that I would not question him.
No, look, and we've all discussed this, and again, I've taken offense when Douglas has called me a doctrinal lawyer before because I'm a sociologist, but I'm actually very good at doctrinal law, and I have no notes for Douglas's analysis. It's exactly the same analysis I came to, and it comes back to, even if you're playing Is It Cake, you can't come down on the side of, well, it's cake and fine in this question. So I'm going to move on here and say, well, Dina, I'm going to kick it over to you with a question on the discussion around jus ad bellum. Can you give us what your take on the jus ad bellum situation here is, both in relation to Israel's incursions into Lebanon and Iran's response to that in the missile strikes recently? And I'm sure Douglas and I'll have some comments to make to build on that afterwards.
Absolutely. And I'll take half a step back, right, which is, I mean, I know what bellum know better than I know in bello, but I also am very concerned, and others have noted that, we are too quick to go to in bello. Like we're too quick to assume the reality of war and armed conflict and then see if the different sides have complied, but we don't ask quickly and stringently enough the question, are the respective parties entitled to be using force in the first place, right? And others have made this point much more eloquently, but I think there is something in, let's say, Samoan's version of the argument that says this overemphasis on in bello, especially after 9/11, became eventually a way of legitimizing, the forever war, right? The idea that if you perform war supposedly complying, as even though in this case there isn't even this compliance with IHO, you get a much broader window of action when it comes to ad bello. So, as I said in my introductory comments, I think the language used by Western states, by Keir Starmer, for example, yesterday was remarkable to me, right? Keir Starmer referred to Iran's attack as an act of aggression. And when I say it's remarkable, I mean that, I don't necessarily, I think that there was an unlawful attack under ad bellum, not necessarily under in bello. In bello looks fine. But if that was unlawful, pretty much every single use of force of Israel after the 8th of October 2023 has also been unlawful. Of course, that assumes, as Doug was saying before about IHO, that international law on the use of force applies equally to all states. And I truly don't know if that's true, right? It doesn't seem to apply. What I mean by that is, so Israel, was it a month and a half ago, assassinated one of Hamas's top leaders, also potentially sought by the ICC within the territory of Iran, right? I don't think that the temporal and causal nexus is nearly close to being tight enough to mean that yesterday was an act of self-defense by Iran. I don't think you can exercise, if we think that the initial act was an armed attack, which I think is very plausible to say that it meant, the severity threshold. There is no questions of attribution here. Everything is very straightforward. But I do not think that self-defense is to use force 6 weeks after a one-off attack to avenge upon the killing of someone. That is literally the definition of prohibited armed reprisals. That's textbook why what Article 2, Paragraph 4 and the relevant customary rules were meant to prohibit, right? Now, if this temporal and causal nexus applies to Iran, it should apply to everyone else as well. It should apply. I have always been confused about why the discussion after 9/11 was whether you can use self-defense against non-state actors, instead of being whether you can use self-defense 1 calendar month after the attack took place, which is roughly took a month for the invasion of Afghanistan to begin, right? Someone can check the dates, but I'm pretty sure. So the same applies to the 7th of October. Bracketing the question of whether you can exercise self-defense against the territory that you occupy, again, I think, up until very recently, both Israel and its allies were claiming that Israel is exercising its right to self-defense 12 months after the attacks and all the way down to the border with Egypt, right? Point being, to cut a long story short, what really worries me here is the reciprocity, or in this case, even nominally equal application of the law seems to not apply, right? We are not getting it in extremely explicit terms yet / anymore. But I cannot see why the UK thinks that yesterday was an unlawful use of force, let alone an act of aggression, and at the same time thinks that what Israel has been doing, or for that matter, what the UK has been doing in the context of the war on terror, has been lawful exercises of self-defense. And that worries me, not because I care especially about, the Islamic Republic of Iran's right to bomb targets, but I do care about having an international legal order that doesn't become explicitly hierarchical again, which seems to me, I obviously think that was always immanent in the legal order, but I think what has happened in the last 12 months is the subtext becoming text in how rules seem to apply differently to different actors. On that point, I'll stop my rant and we'll give the floor to Tamsin or to Douglas, whoever wants to chime in.
Yeah, so I kind of want to chime in and build on what you're saying. I don't disagree with anything you're saying there, except for the fact that I actually have questions over whether or not Iran's attack was an act of aggression and unlawful, but I'll get to that in a minute. First point is on Article 51, self-defense, and noting it's also collective self-defense. The requirement still exists on proportionality, and that's a jus ad bellum question, because I would also say that I'm better at jus ad bellum from all of my time working with Article 39 of the Charter and Security Council responses than I am at jus in bello, but enough time working with the military at ADFA and in other places in Australia has left me pretty decent on my jus in bello. It's proportionality. You can only exercise self-defense to the point that it is necessary to prevent the use of force by your opposition. So, first point on that is, clearly that extinguished a long time ago in Gaza. Clearly that was done a long time ago in Gaza. And, the claim, I'm aware that Hezbollah has been launching rockets into Israeli territory for some time in response to what's happening in Gaza. So the first question is, has Hezbollah been exercising functionally on behalf of Lebanon a collective self-defense of Palestine? In which case, and I don't know, I'm not saying they have, I'm saying there's a question there. In which case, that means that there's no right of self-defense to that, because your self-defense is stop engaging in an act of aggression against someone else. You can't exercise a right of self-defense to prevent something that you caused. On that note, but the question I have over Iran and aggression is, I don't have enough information yet about whether or not Lebanon requested assistance from Iran. Because if Lebanon requested assistance from Iran and Iran were only targeting military targets, which the information I have suggests that they were, that's actually not a violation of Article 2.4. It's not an act of aggression. It is collective self-defense under Article 51. And you know what? If you're going to place the head of your intelligence services in the middle of your capital city, surrounded by civilians, it's a lawful target, and you need to be answering questions about the use of human shields, Israel. Thank you very much. And that's what I have to say on that point.
Look, I don't think there is invitation from Lebanon, right? And that, I think, has to also do, obviously, with the internal politics of Lebanon. Hezbollah obviously has close ties with Iran, and Hezbollah is part of the government, but it is not the government of the state, which is why I do think it was an unlawful use of force. But it's only an unlawful use of force if I'm otherwise right that every single thing that has happened since 9/11, if the UK and the US and Australia, for that matter, are right, then I don't think it's obvious why it was an unlawful use of force. But then I don't know that the thing we're talking about is reasonably called the self-defense anymore. That's what worries me, that if we relax so much the causal and temporal, which we have been doing, it's not plausibly self-defense, it's something else. Doug.
And that's why, sorry, just quickly, that's why I said I don't have enough information to assess that question.
Well, we'll come back, I think, to the question of preliminary assessment in our kind of the closing third. The one thing I would say, though, is, we've spoken in a previous episode on the teaching of international law about getting across to students that international law is law in a horizontal system. And the one point I'd make at this point is, in a horizontal system, there have to be real-time assessments by your peers about legal compliance. You might have to walk those back later, but if part of the quote-unquote enforcement of international law is the other international actors saying you have acted legally or illegally in real time so we can assess state practice, then we often have to act on the basis of preliminary information. Look, just to walk this, as it were, back to row it all the way back to the boat shed and just make a few formalist points for anyone perhaps engaging with these issues as a student the first time. Obviously, we've been distinguishing here between use ad bello, when you get to use force by one state against another state, the rules of self-defense, and use in bello, the rules that apply to the conduct of operations at a tactical level. On the use ad bello, a significant question since September 11 has been, when do you get to use force against the territory of another state if you are subjected to an attack by a non-state armed group? So the UN Charter, Article 51, self-defense, is obviously set up on the basis of governing a system of relations between states. It does not obviously or directly contemplate non-state armed groups. I'm sure some historian of the Charter will email me tomorrow and tell me that's totally wrong, but that on its face, Article 51 binds states. Now, what we did have after the terrorist incidents of September 11, 2001 was Security Council Resolution 1368, which invoked ideas of collective self-defense following that terrorist attack on the United States. So it is reasonable to say, on the basis of that and other practice, such as NATO invoking Article 5, that a fairly substantial group of states believe that you can be subject to an armed attack by a non-state armed group. That's step one. Now, you have a right to self-defense if an armed attack occurs. That's step two. So at least in theory, I have no problem with the idea that Israelis can formally claim self-defense following an armed attack by Hezbollah. The critical step that I am still not convinced of is step three. That allows you to take action in another state's territory if the non-state armed group in question isn't a proxy force of that state, right? That, to my mind, remains the unresolved question. Now, obviously, the United States, Israel, the UK, Australia, and a number of others have pioneered the kind of unable and unwilling doctrine. That is, if the territorial state is unable and unwilling to shut down the attack by the non-state armed group, we should be able to exercise self-defense against the territory of the unwitting host state. Now, the problem with that thesis is it has always been supported only by a very limited number of states, and international law is a numbers game, right? It's a consensus-based system. You don't get to make rules just amongst a little club of states unless they only bind those states, right? You can't make up rules with your friends and then impose them on others. That's not how the system works. And the killer for me has always been to kind of ask, anytime these arguments are made, all right, there's a limited number of states in the world that are capable of projecting force against their neighbours. The vast majority have very limited means to do so. Why would the vast majority of states accept that it is in their interests to have such a doctrine, right? When they are more likely to be the ones invaded than doing the invading. There is no rational reason the majority of existing states would support an unable or unwilling doctrine. So as far as I'm concerned, you do not have a right of self-defense against a non-state armed group in another state's territory. Now, the pushback then will be, well, you're asking a state to sit on its hands. My answer to that would be no, there are very limited exceptions in the law that will allow you to deal with these situations. And the most obvious one for me is necessity. Now, this is probably a very long way of making the same point you guys have just made. Now, I do not think anyone coming to these things for the first time can just Google it later. I do not think the Caroline incident is a good statement of the law of self-defense. I do think it's a good statement of the law of necessity. And in the Caroline incident, the formula adopted was where you have a necessity of self-defense, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. Under a circumstance where you can see that the non-state armed group is about to strike you again, and you have a clear moment to act, then I think under the doctrine of necessity, you could strike at a non-state armed group in another state's territory. You cannot conduct a wide-scale, indefinite ground campaign unless you can get a United Nations Security Council Chapter 7 resolution, right? Or unless the territorial state invites you in to deal with the problem. Otherwise, all you've got is necessity. And I actually think that given that the law on the use of force has been meant to encourage self-restraint since the end of the Second World War, I don't regard that as problematic. Now, I would regard that as a purely formalist analysis, but I think I might land in the same place as you guys, even if I've come a longer way round the house.
And can I say something to make things even more complicated here, which is, I think problems start in earlier steps of the analysis to the extent that at least, so we know that after the 7th of October, like Hezbollah started firing rockets. The problem is the first rockets seemingly were not thrown into territory of Israel, probably so-called. They were thrown into Sheba farms. For those listeners who are lucky enough not to know, Sheba farms is territory occupied by Israel. Israel recognizes that it does occupy this territory. It says that it will only return it to Syria. Lebanon and especially Hezbollah claim that this is properly Lebanese territory, right? So there is a question on whether this is occupied Lebanese or occupied Syrian territory. But very technically, it's not very technically, it's not actually Israeli territory, at least that part. After the 8th, it is absolutely true that Hezbollah has been also launching rockets within the 48 borders of Israel. But then again, we would have to start the assessment from scratch in deciding who is defending and who is attacking, right? Because again, I think it would raise a lot of questions to say that Israel is using force to defend territory that it occupies, right? Because then we're discussing self-defense to protect occupied territory.
Right.
And that
Well,
I
I mean,
think,
my preliminary view would be you don't have a right of self-defense to
yes,
defend occupied
agree.
territory, but and you've just raised the point that, all of these questions are ultimately quite fact-specific. But I guess my previous argument still works on the basis that, even if it weren't occupied, or even if we're only assessing the attacks that have fallen within, Israel's borders proper, you still don't get to a right to an unlimited, open-ended ground campaign in what is unequivocally the territory of a third state.
Yes, yes, yes,
I
absolutely.
would also like to point out that as someone who's done a lot of work on Security Council interventions, historically that invitation into the state to engage in military actions has almost always, without fail, gone through a request for the Security Council to implement Chapter 7 peacekeeping measures. It is not I am unaware of any instance since the implementation of the Charter where it has been to a state themselves rather than to a Security Council UN collective force.
Thanks, Tamsin. So my final substantive question is something we have been dancing around from the beginning of this recording, which is the role of international lawyers, and especially I would say international humanitarian law experts in all this. A couple of days after the Paige's attack, Douglas, you posted a thread on the website formerly known as Twitter, in which you lamented what I understood you to say is a certain unwillingness by many IHL experts to perform any robust assessment of Israel's, and let's say of Israel plus a few Western states, uses of force by constantly postponing and say we just don't have enough information, and then by the time we have enough information, it's 2 years, everyone has moved on to the next calamity, right? And you expressed a number of concerns about this tendency, and I was wondering, and the question is directly to Doug, but also Tamsin is also open to you. What do you think this does for international law, and why are you so concerned and irate about it?
Well, thanks, Ntina. So let me sort of back up to the origins of the tweet thread, which I described as being, asking the rhetorical question, are we at a Solferino moment? And the point there being that in 1862, Henri Dunant's account of the battlefield suffering at Solferino led to the formation of the International Committee of the Red Cross and eventually modern humanitarian law. The point being that someone went out and witnessed a scale of human suffering that common morality was no longer willing to put up with. So we needed more and better law to regulate war. And where I was coming from was this idea that certain branches of law start in moral intuition. This is bad and we need to do something to make human suffering on the battlefield less bad. Now, there's a sort of complex virtue to that, right? And to the possibilities of law. IHL is both a necessary and terrible branch of the law because it starts by accepting that war occurs, right? And war is in itself, one of the greater, if not the greatest human evil. But international humanitarian law takes upon itself the burden of making that more humane. And Sam Moyne and others have criticized, shown the problems with that approach. But the fundamental moral intuition, I would claim, isn't necessarily a bad one. The problem is when you apply simple moral intuitions to a complex world, you wind up with what we do, lawyering, right? You wind up with more and more complex rules. But the difficulty with that proliferation of more complex and more specific rules is that those who administer them become a kind of cloistered, self-referential priesthood. And what disturbed me in writing that tweet thread was that a lot of IHL commentary at the moment has this quality of being something completely divorced from any connection with the basic shared morality required for the law to retain any force. And as we've touched on, what I called a trope in this regard is the no evaluation until all the facts in. An insistence that absent absolute precision, not even preliminary legal assessments can be offered. And I think that often confuses the standard of proof we require for a criminal finding of guilt with the standard of proof we require for a question of state responsibility, right? Not every breach of IHL is a war crime. We don't have to convince ourselves beyond reasonable doubt that a bad thing has occurred to say that the law has been broken. But also another trope is, outcome-driven assessments are impermissible. So people look at the scale of human suffering and go, and this is quite an everyday piece of reasoning at the moment, the scale of suffering here proves a breach of proportionality. And the IHL lawyer will wag their finger at you and go, well, that's an outcomes-driven assessment. You're looking at the bad thing that happened and say, therefore must have been a breach of the law. So it's one thing to say correctly that the legality of an attack can only be assessed based on what the commander knew at the time, not necessarily the outcomes of their action. But it seems to me that that trope of reasoning is being used to say what we see to have happened afterwards is in no way probative of what the commander should have been able to foresee, right? I'm not saying it proves what they knew, that they absolutely intended what happened, and I'm already sliding into the language of intention and proof, which I didn't mean to. But to say it's completely irrelevant suddenly evacuates the humanity from the situation entirely and insists on what I've called in other contexts an almost literally bloodless assessment, right? It becomes gauche to look at the scale of what's occurred. And so the result is this sort of two-speed IHL analysis, where one speed of it is there's no way of offering even preliminary legal views until the conflict is over and all the facts have finally been established, which leads to the consequences you've said, Ntina. The other one is basically a tone which comes out as sort of this hectoring, shutting other people down tone of debate, which is just to say, for very specific reasons beyond lay comprehension or the comprehension of most other international lawyers, this was not illegal, right? Or the grounds on which it has been said to be illegal are incorrect. And it really gets me that a lot of the people who say this will talk to me quite differently in private, right? I've had conversations with significant IHL lawyers who I trust who have said to me in terms things like, I don't know what Israel is doing, or Israel has now accepted a degree of legal risk anyone else would describe as untenable, and they're operating at best at the very limits of the law. Or even things like, I know for a fact that Israel is sending reservists into the field who have not had an IHL legal refresher in quite some time. And often when I've put to some of these people statements like, based on Haaretz reporting, it appears that there has been, at least in some theatres, a complete breakdown of command and control over frontline soldiers. They'll go, yeah. But the same people will not say these things in public.
Yes, absolutely.
Tamsin.
And sorry.
Just my final point then is, like, the bottom line in all of this for me is, if in this conflict in particular, IHL is not capable of ruling anything clearly illegal, then it risks completely devaluing itself as a body of law. I mean, we always say, the current situation we're in is a crisis of legitimacy. I genuinely think this is a really dangerous time for international humanitarian law as a discipline. And I think people who have spent a good chunk of their career promoting views of the law that maximize the freedom of movement for military commanders in the field have a lot to answer for.
For sure. And I think the same applies to jus ad bellum, right? People who have spent their careers finding ways to loosen further and further to 4 and 51 of the Charter should look themselves in the mirror. Tamsin,
Okay.
you started this by this is not cake.
Yeah, and we come back to is it cake thing. But first of all, I want to point out that whether or not you meant to, Douglas, you made a Foucault reference, and I'm very proud of myself for the fact that I have now got you making oblique Foucault references to lawyers being the priesthood of society. And I'm very proud of myself on that one. So, intentional or not, I'm claiming a victory. Okay, I'm going to go back to in the first few weeks of my PhD, my primary supervisor was a former targeting lawyer, and he made the comment lamenting the nature of targeting law. He said, "Look, unless you were a captured and shackled prisoner or clearly a preteen child without a weapon, I could probably make you a valid target." That was his assessment of targeting law. And that comes back to the point I've made elsewhere, and I'm going to make here again, which comes to the same problem that Douglas is bringing up from a different framework. We, as lawyers dealing with difficult things, and as people dealing with these sorts of difficult things, be it genocide, be it mass atrocities, be it targeting, we have a tendency to see people as data points and not people. And it's a self-protection mechanism. It's the only way most people's psyches can cope with it. And I've discussed it elsewhere with on borderline jurisprudence when I talked about my tendency when I'm in cities with war memorials of intentionally reading the names of people at those memorials to remind myself that these people are not data points. They're people. And what we have here are lawyers, particularly IHL lawyers, who are unwilling to accept that what they are treating as data is people. And it leads to all the problems Douglas is discussing. I'm not even questioning that. I agree wholeheartedly. And the problem is that we are treating it as a game of is it cake? It's data of is it a target or not data. We're not talking about people anymore. We're talking about, in clinical terms, about target or not target. And the question of looking at the extent of the suffering for all the IHL lawyers saying, well, you can't judge proportionality based on outcomes. I can judge the jus ad bellum question on outcomes regarding that on proportionality because self-defense has to be proportional. And at that point, I can just look at the level of destruction and say clearly not proportional to the threat that was faced. Regardless of proportional to military advantage questions of targeting, the jus ad bellum question requires proportionality. And that one, I can look at scale of suffering and say clearly not proportional, clearly not a lawful jus ad bellum. Even if all your jus in bello was fine, which I question, your jus ad bellum wasn't, so get fucked. But the issue here, and the issue is that, and I've made this comment elsewhere, I don't know if I've made it just to my students or on a podcast, law schools are really good at teaching law students to think like lawyers. When teaching ethics, I tell my second year students, there'll be a moment where you're sitting in a bar talking with your friends and your friends had a rough week and they're talking about their problems and you're nodding and listening along. But in your head, what you're really thinking about is, do they have a cause of action? You're not, and that's the moment you think like a lawyer. And we're really good at teaching people how to think like lawyers, which means responding with the law, causes of action, and with kind of a clinical lack of empathy. What we're not good at in law schools is teaching them to be people again. And I think half of the problem is that all the IHL lawyers who are playing Is It Cake have forgotten how to be a person. And I'm sorry, be better. Just do fucking better.
I think we can stop with that, and I'll take us to our usual questions, the traditional 3 questions that we ask each other before we conclude. And the first one is because we all have so many thoughts on these issues. And perhaps we have thought this through for quite a while. My question would be, what recommendation do you have for anyone who would like to know more about what we discussed today? What should they read? What should they watch? What should they listen to?
Okay, I'm gonna start with go read Gary Simpson's chapter in Law, War, and Crime on the grey zone issue around terrorism and in an IHL. I would also suggest if you want to understand non state actor armed groups, go read Rob McLaughlin's The Recognition of Belligerency in IHL in Armed Conflict. It was published a few years ago. Now, I would describe Rob as a centrist technocrat in terms of how he does his law, and I mean that as a neutral qualifier, but he is a lawyer's lawyer. It's going to give you a very technical and very good legal historian unpacking of that question of, is it a belligerent? Is it a civil uprising? Is it protesters? Is it terrorism? Or is it actual belligerency? And that scale of threshold across from a legal and historical perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tamsin. Douglas.
Look, I'm going to recommend rival podcasts, which probably breaches some internal etiquette. But Adil Haq and Yanina Dill did a very good episode recently on the Jib Jab podcast, which goes into, in great detail, questions of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in attack and the associated mental states for anyone who wants a more technical understanding of that. And we've name-checked Sam Moyne a couple of times on his arguments around these issues. He did a terrific episode on a podcast out of Pakistan, At War, which I'll provide the link to as well.
Yes, fantastic. And my recommendation is, if people want to try figure out how IHL people got so chummy with the military, David Kennedy's Of Law and War is a really nice kind of like lay anthropology of IHL, folks. All right, this is really dark and heavy stuff. What is your current escape route? What are you doing or reading or viewing that takes your mind off international law and also off all this death and destruction? Douglas.
So I recently realized that in terms of escape routes I haven't recommended or confessed to previously, I have a hobby of accumulating Cold War paperback spy novels by Len Deighton, who I regard as a better writer in the British Cold War spy novel genre than Jean le Carré. And I've just been sitting down on the beach with my family this week reading his 1981 novel XPD, which weirdly fuses several of Deighton's obsessions: Nazi Germany, British intelligence, and the Los Angeles film scene of the 1980s into a very entertaining romp. I think he's got a fantastic ear for dialogue. He is unfortunately of his time in attitudes towards sexual relations, but if one can take that with a grain of salt, I think Deighton's a very entertaining writer.
Awesome. That sounds amazing, actually. Tamsin.
Okay, so a few things. What you may not know, people may not know, is I'm a major sci-fi fan. So Tex Talks Tech, Tex of the Black Pants Legion, does a whole bunch of quasi-history lectures on the Battletech universe, and he just released a new episode that I thoroughly enjoy. It's armed conflict and stompy robots in space. I thoroughly enjoy it. It's kind of a bit of a nerd thing. You've got to enjoy the Battletech world. So there was a new episode of that, and I've just finished a watch through of The Big Bang Theory because I needed something light and fuzzy, and watching a bunch of academics learn how to be people was kind of fun. And while I've been watching those, I've been doing a lot of Sudokus.
Makes sense. Okay, final question, because our listeners are not seeing what we are seeing, and I cannot believe my eyes. Doug, what are you wearing?
Well, technically, I'm still on leave, so I haven't been back into the office. So I'm wearing a white TM Lewin shirt patterned with a sort of cheerful spring, small blue pattern of hummingbirds, and I've rather daringly got my top two buttons undone. And then I'm wearing some very kind of flappy culotte style trousers because it's a warm spring day here in Canberra.
Not just top two buttons and open collar, also no cufflinks and sleeves rolled up slightly. Like this is total party fun time chill dog.
Yeah, that's the most informal I've seen Dag for a while.
Annual leave, people. Remember to take some.
Yes, absolutely. Mine is kicking in on the 22nd of November, not that I'm counting. Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for listening. We will drop the links, everything we mentioned under the pod. Bye, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.